Aeneid, Book 12. When Turnus saw that the Latin forces were beaten down, saw that his promises had now come due, and that all eyes were on him, his pride hardened to iron, and his spirit burned. A lion prowling the fields round Carthage is wounded in the chest by hunters, and only then wakens to war. Tossing his shaggy mane with joy, he snaps the spear, and roars with blood-stained mouth. So too the fury mounting in Turnus. He stormed to King Latinus and said, "I'm not waiting. There is no need for Aeneas and his cowards to recant. I'll meet him in single combat. Draw up the pact, father, and begin the rites. Either this arm pitches the aged tramp into Tartarus, with the Latins watching, and my sword restores our nation's honor, or he rules with Lavinia as his bride." And Latinus, steady and calm, replied, "The more spirited you, our champion, are, the more heroic, the more carefully must I ponder and weigh every chance. You have your father Daunus' kingdom and all the towns ye have taken in war. Nor do I, Latinus, lack gold or influence. There are in Latium other brides of noble birth for you. Now listen to me hard, and take this to heart. All the oracles and augurs forbade me to wed my child to any of the suitors she had in the past, but I was overcome by love for you and our ties of kinship, overcome by the tears of my sorrowful queen, and I broke all bonds. I betrayed my child's betrothed, and took up impious arms. From that day on, you see, Turnus, how I have been beset by war and the burdens you, above all, must bear. Defeated twice in battle, we can scarcely guard, even within our walls, the hopes of Italy. The Tiber still flows warm with our blood. The great plains are white with our bones. Why do I waver? What madness possesses me? If with Turnus dead, I am ready to accept the Trojans as allies, why not end the struggle while he is still unharmed? What will they say, your Rutulian kinsmen, the rest of Italy, if fortune avert my words, I deliver you to death, while you ask to marry my daughter? Give some thought to war's hazards. Pity your aged father, sorrowing in Ardea." Latinus's words did nothing to dispel Turnus's fury. The very attempt inflamed his rage and made it mount higher. When he could speak again, he had this to say: "For my sake, sire, do nothing for my sake, and permit me to purchase fame with death. I too can throw spears, father, and when I strike, blood flows from the wound. His goddess mother won't be there for him, lurking in the mist to hide his womanly flight in a cloud." But the queen, reeling with horror at the new rules of engagement, wept and raved for death as she clung to the man betrothed to her daughter. "By these tears, I beg you, Turnus, by any reverence you have for your beloved Amata, you are my only hope, the only comfort of my sad old age, and on you depend the honor of Latinus and the declining fortunes of our house. This one thing I beg of you, do not commit yourself to this combat. Whatever fate awaits you in battle awaits me also, and together with you I will leave this hateful light before I see Aeneas as my captor and my son." Lavinia heard her mother's words, tears stinging her cheeks, and the blood ran to her face, like crimson dye staining Indian ivory or the blush of white lilies mingled with roses. Turnus stared at the girl, distraught by his love for her. Then, more avid than ever for war, he turned to Amata and said briefly, "Don't pester me with tears or be a bird of ill omen as I go off to battle, mother. Turnus cannot delay his death. Edmund, take this message to the Phrygian, a message he will not be glad to hear. As soon as tomorrow's dawn, riding in her crimson chariot, reddens the sky, let him not lead his Teucrian troops against the Rutulians. Let Teucrian arms and Rutulians rest. We will decide the war with our own blood. On that field let Lavinia be wooed and won as bride." Turnus spoke and ran back into the palace. He called for his horses and smiled to see them neighing and prancing. Horses Eurytia herself had given to Polymnus, glorious animals, whiter than snow, faster than the wind. The grooms were drumming on their chests with cupped palms and combing their manes. Turnus strapped on his shoulders a corselet plated with gold and pale bronze. He hefted a shield, put on a crimson-crested helmet, and slung on the sword that the Lord of Fire had made for Daunus, dipping the white-hot steel in the waters of Styx. His spear was leaning against a column in the middle of the hall, a spear taken as a spoil from Auruncan actor. Turnus gripped the stout spear, shook it, quivering, and cried out, "Spear that has never failed my call, the hour has come! Actor once bore you mightily, now you are in the hands of Turnus. Grant that I lay the Phrygian eunuch out of the ground, rip away his corselet, and grind into the dirt his pretty hair, crisped with curling irons and dripping with myrrh." By these furies Turnus was driven. His face burned and spat sparks, and his eyes shot flames. When a bull prepares to fight, he bellows horrifically, and concentrating his anger in his horns, charges a tree trunk and spars with the wind or scatters sand with his hoofs. Aeneas too was like this, a fierce presence in his armor his mother had given him. He whetted his soul for war, and he fanned his anger, glad that the war would be settled on the terms offered. Then he comforted his comrades in Iülus, who was sad and afraid, reminding them of his destiny. And he ordered that a firm and clear response be conveyed to King Latinus, declaring the terms of peace. Dawn scattered radiance on the mountain tops as the horses of the sun rose from the sea, breathing light from flared nostrils. Rutulians and Trojans had measured the field for combat before the city walls, and in its center were preparing sod altars to their common gods. Priests in vestments, verbena on their brows, were bringing spring water and fire. The Ausonian army marched out from the gates in close formation. Opposite them, all the Trojan and Tyrrhenian troops streamed forward, variously equipped, but each armed with steel as if for battle. Amid these thousands the captains rushed, resplendent in gold and purple, Mnestheus of the house of Assaracus, brave as Silas, and Messapus, breaker of horses, in the line of Neptune. They all withdrew to their own side, stuck their spears in the earth, and rested their shields against them. Then, eagerly pouring forth, the mothers, the unarmed masses, the feeble old men sat on rooftops and towers and stood on the gates. Juno was watching all of this from the hill now called Alban, unnamed at the time and without fame or glory. She gazed out over the plain at the double lines of Laurentum and Troy and at Latinus' city. Then she abruptly addressed, goddess to goddess, Turnus' sister, mistress of still water and sounding rivers, in honor Jupiter, lord of the sky, had bestowed upon her in return for taking her virginity. Nymph, glory of rivers, my heart's delight, you know how I have given you preference over all the Latin girls who have climbed into Jove's thankless bed. You alone I have gladly given a place in heaven. Learn now, Juturna, your sorrow, and do not blame me. While fortune seemed to allow it, and fates permitted Latium to prosper, I protected Turnus and your city. Now I see him facing a destiny he does not deserve. His doom is upon him, and the fatal stroke is near. I cannot look upon this ordained combat. If you dare to help your brother now, go on, it becomes you. It may still be that better fortune will befall the damned. At this, Juturna wept profusely, and 3 times, 4 times her hand beat her lovely breast. But Juno cried, "This is no time for tears. Hurry, and if there is any way at all, save your brother from death, or renew the war and strike the treaty from your hands. I, Juno, order you to dare." With this exhortation, Juno left her mind stunned and her heart in pain. And now the kings came forth. Latinus rode in a 4-horse chariot of impressive size. Around his brows shone 12 golden rays, insignia of the ancestor the sun. Turnus drove a white pair and brandished a brace of spears with broad iron heads. From the camp opposite came Aeneas, father of the Roman race, his starry shield and celestial arms a blaze of glory, and with him was Ascanius, Rome's second hope. A priest in immaculate vestments brought a young boar and unshorn sheep, and set them beneath the blazing altars. The heroes faced the rising sun, sprinkled the victims with salted meal, cut the forelocks, and poured libations from shallow bowls upon the altars. Then pious Aeneas, sword in hand, prayed, "I call to witness the sun, and this land for which I have endured many trials, and the Father Almighty, and you, his consort, Saturnia, kinder at last now, goddess, I pray, and Mars in his glory, father of all war, and I call upon the springs and rivers, and the powers of the air and the blue sea. If victory falls to Turnus the Ausonian, the vanquished will withdraw to Evander's city. Iülus shall leave this land, and Aeneas' sons will never return to renew this war or challenge this realm with the sword. But if victory grants that we will win this field, as I think shall be, and may the gods so confirm, I will not demand that the Italians be subject to Teucrians, nor seek dominion for myself. Let both nations, unconquered, commit to everlasting peace under equal laws. I will ordain rights and gods. Latinus, my father-in-law, will retain command. Authority will remain with my father-in-law. For me the Teucrians will raise my city walls, and Lavinia shall give the town her name." Latinus spoke next. Looking up to the heaven, he stretched his right hands to the stars, saying, "By these same powers I too swear, Aeneas, by earth, sea, and stars, by Latona's twins and 2-faced Janus, by the lords of the world below and the shrine of Dis, may the Father of all, who sanctions treaties with his thunderbolt, hear my words. I touch the altars and swear by the fires and gods between us, the day will not dawn that will break this peace and truce for Italy, however things may fall, nor shall any power change my will, though it may drown earth into flood and dissolve sky into the abyss. Sooner will the scepter I held sprout leaves and branch again, though it has been cut at the root, bereft of its mother, and the axe had pared off leaf and twig. Once it was a tree, but now the craftsman's hands have sheathed it in bronze for the elders of Latium to bear. With such words they ratified the treaty in the presence of the leaders. Then they cut the throats of the consecrated beasts over the flames, tore out the living entrails, and piled the altar high with platters of meat. But it had long seemed to the Rutulians that the fight was not fair. Their hearts were filled with doubt, and all the more when they saw the ill-matched combatants up close. Turnus added to their dismay by walking quietly like a suppliant approaching an altar with downcast eyes, his cheeks hollow, youthful body pale. When his sister Juturna saw the talk begin to spread, and the whole crowd waver, she entered their midst disguised as Camers, a man of noble birth whose family had a name for valor, and who was himself a warrior, entered their midst, and, knowing well the ways of men, let drop a few choice words. "Aren't you ashamed, Rutulians, to risk one man's life when we have an army like this? Aren't we their match in numbers and strength? Look, this is all of 'em, Trojans, Arcadians, and the superstitious Etrurians who hate Turnus. Even if only every other man of us fought, there would barely be enough of them. Turnus's fame will lift him to the gods, upon whose altars he has sworn in his life, and shall be kept alive on the lips of men. But we, our country lost, will become slaves, we who today lounge around in the fields." This brought their feelings to the boiling point, and a murmur rippled through the ranks. Not only the Rutulians, but the Latins too, were transformed, and the Laurentines. Those who had been hoping for rest and safety now wanted their weapons, prayed for the truce to be broken, and pitied Turnus's unjust fate. Juturna showed them something more, a sign in high heaven, none more potent to confuse the minds of the sons of Italy and cheat them with its portent. Flying across the red sky, Jupiter's bird, a golden eagle, was chasing a clamorous flock of shorebirds, when it swooped down suddenly to the water and snatched in its talons a noble swan. The Italians snapped to attention and saw, to their amazement, all of the birds turn in flight with a rush of wings that darkened the sky, pursuing their enemy until the eagle, overcome by the attack and the swan's sheer weight, dropped its prey into the stream and took refuge in the clouds. The Rutulians greeted this omen with a shout. They were ready for battle. Tolumnius, the augur, took the lead and cried, "This is what I have been praying for. I accept. I acknowledge the gods. With me as a leader. Take up your weapons. You've suffered enough, like these frail birds, harassed by a shameless foreign invader who has been ravaging your shores. He too will take flight and spread his sails far out to sea. Now close ranks with one heart. Your king has been seized. Fight to defend him." With that Tolumnius ran forward and rifled a spear at the enemy lines. Men could hear the hiss of the cornel shaft as it split in the air. A thundering shout went up from the crowd, and their hearts raced as the spear flew on. Fate had it that 9 brothers stood in its path, beautiful boys born to Arcadian Gylippus by his faithful Tuscan wife. One of them, especially handsome in his gleaming armor, was hit by the spear, which pierced his ribs just above the buckle of his stitched belt that cinched his waist, and laid him out on the yellow sand. His brothers, a spirited band, were stung with grief, and rushed blindly ahead, some with swords drawn and others with spears. A Laurentine column charged out to meet them, and these were countered by a flood of Trojan and Agollene troops, and Etruscans in their emblazoned armor, all with one passion, to let cold steel rule. The altars were stripped bare, the sky seethed with javelins, and the iron rain fell hard. Sacred vessels in the fire were carried off, and Latinus himself fled, bearing away his defeated gods, the truce null and void. Men were raiding their chariots, or leaping onto horseback, ready with drawn swords. Messapus, in his zeal to overcome the truce, drove his horse straight at Alcestis, an Etruscan. This man, a king and wearing a king's insignia, backed away, tripped, and fell head and shoulders onto an altar behind him. Messapus was over him in a flash, spear in hand, and although Alcestis, poor wretch, pleaded long, came down hard on him with his beam of the spear, and said, "He's had it, one of our better victims for the great gods." The Italians crowded around and stripped the body while it was still warm. Corynaeus was in their path, and as Abisus came up to hit him, he snatched up a charred brand from an altar and shoved it in Abisus's face, igniting his huge beard, which gave off a stench as it burned. Corynaeus followed this up by clutching the hair of his bewildered foe in his left hand and coming up hard with his knee to bring him down, where he finished him off with the sword stroke to the side. Podalirius had chased down the shepherd Alsus as he was rushing through a hail of weapons, and now towered over him with his naked sword. But it was Alsus who, with the swing of his axe, cleaved through his enemy's brow and chin, spattering his armor with gore. Iron slumber pressed hard onto Podalirius' eyes, and their light was shrouded in eternal night. But steadfast Aeneas, head bare, stood stretching out his unarmed hand and calling in a louder voice to his men. "Where are you going? What is this sudden surge of strife? Hold in your rage! The truce had already been struck, its term set. I alone have the right to fight. Let me do it. Forget your fears. This hand will make the treaty true. These rights have already given Turnus to me." As Aeneas was saying these things, an arrow whistled through the air toward him in a long falling arc, shot by whose hands no one knows, nor whether it was pure chance or some god who brought the Rutulians this glory. Credit for the deed is hidden, and no one boasted of wounding Aeneas. When Turnus saw Aeneas withdraw and his captains in disarray, he burned with new hope. He called for his horses and arms, bounded into his chariot, and proudly took the reins in his hands. That chariot ride brought death to many. Many he rolled over half alive, crushing entire platoons under hooves and wheels, and picking off those who tried to escape with spear after spear. Blood-stained Mars thunders with his shield to rouse men to war, as he gives his frenzied horses free rein along the icy Hebrus river. They run so fast over the open plain that not even the winds can keep up, and the land of Thrace moans with the beat of their hooves. Along with the god drives his satellites, the dark shapes of terror and rage and treachery. So too Turnus, whipping his foaming, sweat-glazed horses through the lanes of battles, trampling his foes. Pity those killed under the flying hooves as they splashed through the blood and kicked up sand mingled with gore. Sthenelus fell to Turnus at long range, Thamyris and Pholus in close encounters. He also killed from a distance Glaucus and Lades, whom their father Imbrasus had raised in Lycia and equipped with matched set of arms, one for close combat, the other for fighting from wind-swift horses. Elsewhere, Eumedes rode into battle, Dolon's famous son, named after his grandfather, but with the heart and hands of his father, who at Troy dared to ask as his reward for going as a spy to the Danaan camp the horses of Achilles. Diomedes gave him quite a different reward, and Dolon no longer aspired to Achilles' horses. When Turnus saw his son far off in the plain, he sent a spear after him through empty space, and then, catching up with the man, halted his team and jumped from the chariot. Standing over the fallen Dian Eumedes, Turnus planted a foot on his neck, wrested the sword from his hand, and reddened the shining blade deep in his throat, saying, "Take a good look, Trojan, at these fields, the Hesperia you came to conquer in war. Lie there and measure out every acre. This is the reward for those who try me with the sword, and this is how they build their city walls." Then, with the cast of his spear, Turnus sent Aspides to keep Eumedes company, and added Chlorius, Sybaris, Dares, Thersilochus, and then Thymedes, who fell from the neck of his bucking horse. The north wind roars on the deep Aegean and drives the waves shoreward, and where the wind swoops down clouds scud through the sky. Wherever Turnus cuts his path, the ranks fell back and men turned and ran. His own momentum carried him on, and as his chariot split the air, his plumes streamed in the wind. Phegeus could not bear to face his onslaught. Half out of his mind, he threw himself in front of the chariot, and grabbing the reins, wrenched aside the frothing jaws of the horses. While he was dragged along, hanging from the yoke, Turnus's broad lance found his unguarded side and ripped through the double-plated corslet, just grazing the skin. But as Phegeus twisted around and tried to engage the sword, the turning wheel whirled him over and onto the ground. As Turnus passed by, he swung his blade between the lower rim of Phegeus' helmet and the upper edge of his breastplate, slicing off his head, and left his maimed body to lie in the sand. While Turnus was dealing death all over the plain, Menestheus and loyal Achates, with Ascanius at their side, led Aeneas into the camp, bleeding and limping as he leaned on his spear. He grit his teeth as he struggled to extract the head of the broken shaft. He called for the most direct approach, telling them to cut into the wound down to the dark recess where the point was lodged and send him back into battle. And now Iapix was there, Iasus' son, dearest of all to Phoebus Apollo. The god, deeply in love with the boy, had offered to give him all of his arts, prophecy, the lyre, his own swift arrows, but Iapix, whose father was dying, wanted to put off his fate, and to that end preferred to know the virtues of herbs and the skills of a healer, and to practice without glory the silent arts. Aeneas leaned on his great spear, chafing at the delay, surrounded by a crowd of warriors, his sad Iülus among him. The hero stood unmoved by their tears. The aged physician tucked up his robes in a Paeonian fashion, and treated Aeneas with his healing hands and Phoebus' potent herbs, but all in vain. In vain he pulled out the arrow with forceps, with no good fortune, no help from Apollo. Panic and rout were spreading more widely over the plains. War's horror was upon them. The sky was a solid wall of dust. The horsemen were closing in fast. Spears and arrows rained down on the camp, and the iron noise rose to heaven with the cries of men fighting, and of men falling under the fist of Mars. Then Venus, shaken by her son's undeserved plain, plucked from Cretan Ida a stalk of dittany with downy leaves and purple flowers, an herb wild goats eat when shot with an arrow. This herb Venus brought down, her face shrouded in mist. She steeped the plant in a gleaming cauldron full of river water to bring out its hidden, okay, Pinterest, I don't care, medicinal virtues, and sprinkled in juices of healing ambrosia and fragrant panacea. Not knowing what he had, old Iapix was bathing Aeneas's wound with this water. Suddenly all the pain went out of his body. The wound stopped bleeding. The arrow slipped out easily in the healer's hand, and all of Aeneas's old strength returned. "Hurry and bring the man his weapons! Why are you standing there?" Iapix said this, and he was the first to fire them up for battle. "This did not happen by any human power, nor was it my art that saved you, Aeneas. A greater power, a god, is at work here and sending you back to do greater deeds." Aeneas was hungry for the fight. Impatient of any delay, he clapped golden greaves onto his shins and started handling a spear. As soon as his breastplate was strapped on and his shield was fitted to his side, he put his arms around Ascanius, kissed him lightly through the helmet, and said, "Learn how to be a man from me, my son. Learn good fortune from others. Today my hand will defend you in war and lead you to great rewards. When you come of age, see to it that you remember the example of your kinsmen, and that your father, Aeneas, and your uncle Hector enliven your soul." Aeneas spoke and then moved through the gates, huge himself and brandishing a massive spear. Close by his side were Antaeus and Menestheus, and behind them the entire army poured out, emptying the camp. The plain boiled with blinding dust, and the shocked earth trembled under the tramping feet. From the wall opposite, Turnus saw them coming. The Ausonians saw them, and a cold shudder ran through their bones. Before any of the Latins, Juturna heard the sound, knew it, and turned and fled. Aeneas was flying, and his dark line of troops was drawn in the wake over the open plains. When a storm breaks at sea and the rain cloud moves towards land, pity the farmers, whose prescient hearts know what is coming, and shudder. Trees will be brought down, crops ruined, everything scattered. The winds run before it, and their howls carry shoreward. Just so the Trojan commander brought his troops up to the front, and they massed around him. Thymbraeus landed his sword on Osiris, Menestheus killed Archidius, Achates Apollo, Gaius Euphens. Even Tolumnius fell, the augur who was first to hurl a spear in the enemy's face. A shout split the air, and the routed Rutulians turned around in a cloud of dust and ran through the fields. Aeneas didn't bother with these fugitives, or even with those who opposed him on foot or mounted. Turnus alone he tracked through the thickening gloom. Turnus alone he called out to combat. Juturna, in her deep distress, knocked Turnus's driver Metiscus out of the chariot and left him behind. The warrior goddess assumed his form, his voice and armor, and took the rippling reins. A black swallow flits through the mansion of a wealthy lord, winging her way through the high halls to scavenge scraps and crumbs for her chirping nestlings, then twittering in and out of the porticos and about the courtyard pools. So too Juturna guided the horses through the enemy ranks and flew in the chariot all over the field, giving them glimpses of her exultant brother, now here, now there, never allowing him to lock up in combat, but always flitting away. Still, Aeneas kept tracking Turnus down through the winding maze of war, calling, and when he spotted him, sprinting to match the horse's speed, only to have Juturna wrench the chariot aside. What could he do? He was all at sea, his mind pulled in contrary directions. Meanwhile, Messapus, treading lightly and carrying 2 javelins tipped with steel, rifled one of them at him with deadly aim. Aeneas went down to one knee and crouched behind his shield as the spearhead sheared the crest from his helmet. He felt a sudden surge of anger at this treacherous attack. He saw Turnus' chariot pulling away, calling to witness Jupiter himself and the altars of the broken treaty. Aeneas plunged into the general combat, and with Mars at his back, began to kill indiscriminately, giving his rage free rein. What god could now unfold for me so many bitter deaths? Which poet could tell of all the captains who met their many dooms, driven over the plain now by Turnus, now by the Trojan hero? Did it please you, Jupiter, that nations destined to live in everlasting peace should clash so harshly? Aeneas, in the first combat that halted the Trojans' onrush, paused only briefly to take out Sucro, driving his steel through the rib cage where death comes most quickly. Turnus unhorsed Amycus and his brother Diores, and then advancing on foot struck down one with his long spear, the other with his sword, and then hanging their severed heads from the chariot, he bore them off, dripping dewdrops of blood. Aeneas sent to their deaths Talos, Tanais, and brave Cethegus 3 in one assault, and then dispatched the shocked Onetus, a Theban whose mother was Peridia. Turnus's next victims were the brothers sent from Apollo's Lycian fields, and Menœtes, an Arcadian who hated warfare in vain. This man had been an humble fisherman near the pools of Lerna. He had no patrons, and his father tilled a rented plot of land. Like fire set on different sides of a wood, a dry thicket of crackling laurels, or like rivers roaring down a mountainside, each destroying everything in its path. So Aeneas and Turnus swept through the battle, each of them seething with rage within, hearts bursting, neither yielding an inch, and all their desire was to wound men with steel. Murranus was boasting of his ancient lineage stretching back to Latin kings when Aeneas hit him with a huge stone that pitched him headfirst over his car, where he was trampled by horses who did not remember their master. Hylas was charging forward with insane fury when Turnus rifled a spear at his golden brow. The point pierced his helmet and struck in his brain. And you, Cretheus, bravest of the Greeks, your right hand did not save you from Turnus, nor did Copernicus's gods protect him when Aeneas came. He put his chest in the way of Aeneas's spear, and the slight reprieve of his bronze shield offered did not help him much. You also, Aeolus, fell at Laurentum and spread your body out in its fields. You, whom the Argive army could not lay low, nor Achilles, destroyer of Priam's realm, here was your end. Your home was in Lyrnessus, under Mount Ida, and Laurentum is your grave. Now all up and down the lines, both armies engaged, all the Latins and all the Trojans, Menestheus and intense Serestus, Messapus, breaker of horses, and brave Asilas, Tuscan troops and Evander's Arcadians, each doing his utmost, each at his limit. No rest, no respite in the vast open conflict. Aeneas's mother now put in his mind to advance on the walls, attack the towns with abrupt force, and throw the Latins into confusion at the sudden slaughter. Tracking Turnus through the lanes of battle, he swept his eyes in every direction and saw the city untouched by the wall, quiet and at peace. At once, a vision of greater conflict burned in his mind. Summoning Menestheus, Sergestus, and brave Serestus, he climbed up a mountain to which the rest of the Trojans came at a run, still holding the spears and shields. Aeneas, standing on this height, addressed them. I want no delay in carrying out my orders. Jupiter is on our side, and I don't want anyone holding back because the decision is sudden. That city, the cause of this war, the heart of Latinus's realm, unless they surrender and submit to our rule, that city I will today overthrow and lay its smoking roofs level with the ground. Am I supposed to wait until Turnus feels like doing battles with me until he comes back for more, beaten though he is? This is the crux of this accursed war, men. Bring torches and reclaim the treaty with fire. They outdid each other in their eagerness, formed a wedge, and advanced to the walls en masse. Ladders and torches appeared from nowhere. One group stormed the gates and cut down the guards, others darkened the skies with their javelins. Aeneas himself stood at the foot of the wall, stretched out his hands, and in a great voice accused Latinus, calling the gods to witness that he was being forced into battle again, that the Italians have twice become his foes, twice broken a treaty. Inside the walls, strife arose among the anxious citizens. Some wanted the city gates thrown open to the Dardanians and called for the king to be dragged to the walls. Others brought arms and marched out to defend their city. A shepherd has followed bees to their hive and tunneled pumice and filled it with smoke. Anxious for the realm, the bees scurry this way and that through the wax fortress and with loud buzzing hone their rage. The black stench billows through the halls. The hollow rock resounds with a blind hum, and the smoke comes out into the empty air. There was more grief for the weary Latins, and it shook the city to its very foundations. When the queen saw the enemy coming into the town, the walls breached, roofs aflame, and no Rutulians, no troops of Turnus opposing them, the poor woman believed that he had perished in battle. In her distress she cried out that she was the cause and the origin of all these evils, and said many other things in her frenzied grief. Determined to die, she tore the royal robes, and from a very high beam hung a noose from her hideous death. When the Latin woman found her dead, first the daughter Lavinia tore out her golden hair and scored her cheeks. Then all of the people around her raved, and the house resounded with their laments. The sad news spread through all the city. Minds and hearts sank. Latinus went about with rent garments, dazed by his wife's death and the city's ruin, his white hair grimed with dust. During all this time, Turnus was pursuing a handful of stragglers at the edge of the plain, moving more slowly now, less and less happy with his horse's brilliance. The wind carried him unseen terrors in the clamor from the town. Then, as he listened intently, a puzzle of sound struck his ears, the murmur of suffering. What are all these cries coming from the city? It must be bad if I can hear it from here. Distracted, he drew in the reins and stopped. His sister, who still looked like Metiscus, and as such was steering the chariot, faced him and said, "Let's keep after the Trojans out here, where we are already winning. There are other troops to defend the town. Aeneas is taking it to the Italians now, and we should be dealing death to the Teucrians. You killed just as many here with no less honor." To which Turnus replied, "I knew it was you. Long ago, sister, when you entered this war and tricked us into breaking the truce, and you don't fool me now, goddess, but why come down from Olympus and endure all this? So you can see your brother's miserable death? What can I do? There are no guarantees. I saw Murranus before my own eyes, calling me as he went down. No one meant more to me. Murranus, a mighty man undone by a mighty wound. Poor Ufens died so he wouldn't have to see my disgrace. The Trojans have his body in arms. And now I should allow our homes destroyed, the final touch, and not refute Drances? Turn tail and let this land see Turnus in flight? Is it so bad to die? Shades below, be good to me. Since the will of heaven has turned against me, I will go down to you, holy in spirit, innocent of any guilt, and never unworthy of my great forbears." He had scarcely finished when Saces, his face wounded by an arrow, came riding up on a panting horse through the enemy lines, calling Turnus by name and imploring him, "Turnus, you are our last hope. Pity your people. Aeneas is storming in battle and threatening to throw down the Italians' topmost towers and destroy them utterly. Torches are already flying to the roofs. The Latins are turning all eyes on you, Turnus. King Latinus himself mutters about whom to call his son, and to which alliance he should turn. Moreover, the queen, who put all her trust in you, is dead, by her own hand, gone from the world of light. Only Messapus and Aeneas are holding the gates, surrounded by squadrons bristling with steel, while you wheel your chariot in an empty field." Turnus was stunned by this changed picture of his fortunes. He stood rooted in silence, his great heart roiling with shame, with grief, verging on madness, with frenzied love and an undeniable courage. When the shadows parted, and light returned to his mind, he swept his blazing eyes toward the walls, furious, and looked back from his chariot at the great city. Flames were spiraling skyward from story to story, about to catch a tower, a defensive bulwark he himself had built, set on wheels and hung with high gangways. "Now, sister, the fates triumph at last. Stop holding me back. We will follow where God and cruel fortune calls us. My mind is made up. I will meet Aeneas and bear death's bitterness. No longer, sister, will you see me shamed, but first allow me to rage with furious rage." Turnus spoke, leapt down from his chariot, and careened madly through the enemy lines, leaving his sorrowing sister behind. Think of a stone crashing down a mountain. Either a storm has washed it free, or time in its passing has loosened it, and now the shameless mass of rock sweeps down the steep slopes and bounds over the earth, rolling along with its trees, herds, and men. So too Turnus, scattering the ranks in his rush to the walls, where the ground was most soaked with blood and the air whined with spears. Turnus lifted his hand, had their immediate attention, and spoke. "Fall back, Rutulians, and you, Latins, hold your fire. Whatever fortune is here is mine. It is better for your sake that I alone make good the treaty and settle the issue with steel." And the troops made room for him in the middle. When Father Aeneas heard Turnus's name, he left the walls and left the high fortress, jettisoned everything he had been doing, and in great exultation clashed his weapons. The sound was like thunder, and the hero, as vast as Mount Athos, vast as Eryx, vast as Father Apennine himself with his shimmering oaks, when he roars in joy and lifts his snowy head toward heaven. And now every last man turned and stared, every Rutulian, Trojan, and Italian soldier, both those high on the walls and those below who were battering the walls, and they all took off their armor. Latinus himself was lost in wonder that these two great men, born in different parts of the world, had met, and now would settle the issue with steel. As soon as the field was cleared out of the plain, they sprinted forward, threw their spears from afar, then waded into battle with a clash of bronze. Earth groaned, sword struck sword with stroke after stroke, luck and valor blending into one. In great Scylla, or high on Tiburnus, two bulls have locked horns in mortal combat. The keepers fall back in fear, and all the cattle stand in silent dread, the heifers musing on who will be lord of the entire herd. The bulls butt heads with tremendous force and gore each other, bathing their backs and shoulders with blood, and the whole grove resounds with their bellowing groans. So too the Trojan and Daunian heroes clashed shield against shield and filled the sky with crashing thunder. Jupiter himself held his balanced scales and placed on them the destinies of each man to determine whom the battle doomed, whose weight sank down to death. Turnus, thinking he could get away with it, sprang forward with sword lifted high and put all of his weight into a sweeping stroke. The shout went from both armies, Trojans and Latins both straining to see, expectant, but the treacherous sword only splintered in mid-stroke. When Turnus saw that his right hand held an unfamiliar hilt, he fled, faster than the east wind. The story is told that when Turnus first mounted his chariot he neglected, in his haste, to bring his father's sword, and snatched up instead the blade of Metiscus his charioteer. This served him well enough when he was chasing down Teucrian stragglers, but when it came against the divine armor forged by Vulcan, the mortal blade shattered like brittle ice into fragments that glittered on the yellow sand. Turnus ran like a madman this way and that across the plain, weaving in circles. The Teucrians closed in, confining him between walls in the desolate marsh. Aeneas, though his knees were slowed by the arrow wound, and he was not at full speed, nevertheless stayed hot on his heels. A hunting hound has caught a stag hemmed in by a stream or by crimson feathers that hunters use to hedge in game. The dog runs and barks and worries the stag, who in terror of the snares in the high bank runs back and forth in 1,000 directions. But the keen Umbrian hound stays close, mouth gaping wide. The hound almost seizes it and snaps its jaws shut as if he had seized it, but bites only the empty air. Another shout arose, echoed by the banks and pools, and the sky thundered with the tumult below. While Turnus ran, while he was full in flight, he reproached the Rutulians, calling them by name, and clamored for his sword. Aeneas, though, promised instant death for anyone who came near and made them tremble by threatening to level their town. Wounded, he pressed on as they ran in loops, circling 5 times, and doubling back he unwove all their circuits, for they were not running for some trivial prize at games, but for the lifeblood of Turnus. There was a bitter-leaved wild olive tree sacred to Faunus out on the plain, revered of old by mariners. Onto this tree they would attach their offerings to the Laurentine god, and in its branches hang their votive garments. But the Teucrians, with no regard for the tree's sanctity, had cut it down so that they could fight on an open field. The spear Aeneas had thrown was struck in the tough roots of this tree, and the Trojan now stooped to pull it out so he could take it down with this weapon. The man he could not catch on foot. Turnus, out of his mind with fear, cried out, "Have pity on me, Faunus and Mother Earth! Hold fast the spear, if I ever honored you, whom the men of Aeneas now profane in war." He spoke, and the gods heard his prayer. Aeneas struggled long with the pliant root, but could not with all of his strength force open its stubborn grip. And while he struggled, Juturna, transformed again into Metiscus, ran up and handed her brother his sword. Venus, outraged at the nymph's audacity, came and plucked the spear out of his root. The 2 heroes, weapons and spirits restored, one trusting his sword, the other towering with his spear, both panting for breath, stood face to face in the arena of war. Meanwhile, the Lord of Olympus addressed Juno as she was watching the fighting from a golden cloud. "Juno, my wife, how will it end? What remains at the last? You yourself know, and you admit that you know, that Aeneas, the hero of his country, is destined to be exalted to the stars. What are you preparing? With what hope do you cling to the chill clouds? Was it right that a god be profaned by mortal's wound? That the sword be returned? Juturna could never have done it without you, which Turnus had lost, or that strength increase in the vanquished? Desist and yield at last to my prayers, lest your great grief consume you in silence, lest your bitter woes return to me often from your sweet lips. We have come to the end. You have had the power to pursue the Trojans over land and sea, to rekindle a terrible war, to disfigure a home, and blend bridals with grief. I forbid you to attempt more." Thus Jupiter, and thus Saturn's daughter, with downcast eyes. "It was because I knew that this was your will, my mighty lord, that with great reluctance I left the earth and left Turnus. Otherwise you would not see me sitting here alone on my airy throne, enduring all, right or wrong. No, I would be standing cinctured in flame on the front lines of battle, dragging the Trojans into mortal combat. As for Juturna, yes, I persuaded her to help her brother, and for his life's sake I sanctioned daring deeds, but not to shoot the arrow, not to bend the bow. I swear to this by the implacable water of Styx, the one inviolable oath for the gods above. And now I yield, and quit this loathsome war. I have one solemn request of you, something not prohibited by fate, for Latium's sake, and for your people's majesty. When soon, let it be, they make peace with happy weddings, and form alliances with laws and treaties, do not command the native Latins to change their ancient name, nor become Trojans, and be called Teucrians, nor to change in language or in dress. Let Latium be. Let Alban kings rule through the ages, and let Roman stock be strong in Italian manhood. Troy has fallen. Let the name of Troy be fallen too." Smiling at her, the world's creator said, "You are Jove's true sister and Saturn's child, the waves of wrath that roll deep in your breast. Come, dismiss the fury that was aroused in vain. I grant your request, and I willingly relent. The Ausonians will keep to their native tongue and ancestral ways, as their name is now. So shall it be. The Teucrians shall be absorbed in the body at large. I will establish their sacred rites and laws and make them all Latins, with a single tongue. From then shall rise a race blended with Ausonian blood, and that you shall see surpass both gods and men in faith and loyalty. And no nation shall be more zealous in Juno's worship. The goddess nodded, happy to assent, then left the clouds and departed from the sky. This done, the father pondered how to withdraw Juturna from her brother's side. There are twin fiends, whom men call Dire, born to the night goddess in the same litter as hellish Megaera. Their mother wreathed the heads of all three with coiling snakes, and gave them wings to ride the winds. These two Dire attend the throne of Jupiter, and whet the fears of feeble mortals when the grim monarch visits them with disease and death, or terrorizes guilty cities with war. Jove sent one of them down from the high heaven with instructions to appear as omen before Juturna. The fiend flew down to the earth in whirling wind. Like an arrow, speeding from a bowstring into a cloud bank, a poisoned arrow shot by a Parthian archer, or a Parthian or a Sidonian, an incurable shaft, winding unseen through the flitting shadows. Thus the child of night, speeding to earth. When she came in sight of the Trojan ranks and the troops of Turnus, she suddenly shrank into the shape of an owl, the small bird that often perches at night on tombs and deserted rooftops, singing its late, unwelcome song through the shadows. So transformed, the fiend flits and screams before the face of Turnus, her dark wings beating his shield. Strange numbing dread washed through Turnus's body. His hair bristled with fear, his voice stuck in his throat. His sister Juturna recognized from afar the harsh whisper of the Dread One's wings. She tore out her unbound hair, her nails clawed her face, and she pounded her breast with her fists. Then she cried out to her brother, "How can your sister help you now, Turnus? And what is left for my own hard life? Nothing I can do will prolong the light for you. Can I oppose this terrible portent? Now at last I quit the field. Don't try to scare me, you ill-omened vultures. I am already afraid. I know the beating of your winds, the sound of death, and I do not mistake the haughty commands of Jupiter. Is this how he compensated me for my lost virginity? Why did he give life everlasting? If I can only die, I can end the sorrow, go through the shadows at my poor brother's side. I am mortal. Nothing can be sweet without you, brother. What ground can gape deep enough to send a goddess to the deepest shades?" So saying, Juturna covered her head with the sea-gray veil, and moaning profusely, the goddess plunged into the river depths. Aeneas kept the pressure on, rocking his tree of a spear, and cried savagely, "What's the delay now, Turnus? Why are you still holding back? This isn't a foot race, you know. It's hand-to-hand combat with cold steel. Go ahead, change yourself into all sorts of shapes. Collect all your courage and skill. Fly away, high on wings if you want, up to the stars, or sink into the hollow earth. I'll get you still." And Turnus, shaking his head, "You don't scare me, Big Mouth. The gods scare me, and having Jupiter as my enemy." Turnus said no more. Looking around, he saw a huge stone lying on the plain, a stone ancient and huge, set in place to settle boundary disputes. 12 chosen men could scarcely lift it onto their shoulders, as men are now, but the hero scooped it up quickly, rose to his full height, and with a burst of speed, hurled it at his adversary. But as he ran, he did not know himself, did not know who he was as he moved towards the immense stone, lifted it, and sent it flying. His knees buckled, his blood was like ice. The stone itself, rolling through the empty air, fell short and did not deliver its blow. In dreams, when night's weariness weighs on our eyes, we are desperate to run farther and farther, but collapse weakly in the middle of our efforts. Our tongue does not work. Our usual strength fails our body, and words will not come. So too Turnus. However bravely he tried, the Dread One would not let him win through. Shifting images spun through his mind. He looked at the Rutulians and the town, frozen with fear. He saw death closing in and trembled. Nowhere to escape. No way to attack his enemy. He could not see his chariot, or his sister the charioteer. While Turnus faltered, Aeneas's fatal spear quivered in the light. Seeing his chance, he put all his weight behind a long-range throw, and his weapon flew with deadly force, faster than a stone hurled by a catapult, and with a sound louder than thunder, roaring through the air like a black tornado, it tore through Turnus's 7-ply shield, ripped open his corselet, and with a hiss, sliced through his thigh. Huge Turnus sank down on one knee. The Rutulians leaped up with a shout, and the woods and hills echoed their groans. Humbled, Turnus lifted his eyes to Aeneas and stretched forth his hands in supplication. "Go ahead, use your chance. I deserve it. I will not ask anything for myself. But, if a parent's grief can still touch you, remember your own father, Anchises, and take pity on Daunus' old age. I beg you. Give me, or if you prefer, give my dead body back to my people. You've beaten me, and the Ausonians have seen me beaten. Stretch out my hand to you. Lavinia is yours. Let your hatred stop here." Aeneas stood there, lethal in his bronze. His eyes searched the distance, and his hand paused on the hilt of his sword. Turnus's words were winning him over. But then his gaze shifted to the fateful baldric on his enemy's shoulder, and the belt glittered within its familiar metalwork, the belt of young Pallas, whom Turnus had killed, his insignia he now wore as a trophy. Aeneas's eyes drank in this memorial of his own savage grief, and then, burning with fury and terrible in his wrath, he said, "Do you think you can get away from me while wearing the spoils of one of my men? Pallas sacrifices you with the stroke. Pallas, it makes you pay with your guilty blood." Saying this, and seething with rage, Aeneas buried his sword in Turnus's chest. The man's limbs went limp and cold, and with a moan, his soul fled resentfully down to the shades. The end. Or is it? Coming up next time on Shakespeare's Julius Caesar.